Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is set in the London of the late Victorian period around the 1880s. But it is very different to many other novels and stories that are set in London at this time. For example, if you've been following my series on Sherlock Holmes, The Sign of Four, the London in this book is very different to the London of the Arthur Conan Doyle novella. In many other stories, the city of London comes alive in the detailed descriptions and almost plays the role of a character in the story itself. But in Jekyll and Hyde, however, while there are descriptions that are most definitely London, there are, under the surface, striking resemblances to another British city. And there's a long held theory that the London of the novel is actually closer to Stevenson's home city of Edinburgh, with which he would have been much more familiar, of course. Now, both cities would have been smog filled, dark, and dangerous places in the late 19th century, but there are certain aspects that are impossible to ignore that relate to events in the novel. At this time in Britain, many people moved from the countryside to the cities. London in the 19th century was a city that had grown enormously in the space of 100 years. In the century from 1800 to 1900, London's population exploded. With roughly 1 million people living in the city at the beginning of the 19th century, London's position as the capital of the British Empire made it attractive to immigrants from all of the empire's colonies, and within 100 years, the population had grown to nearly 7 million people, a hugely significant increase. And it's important to remember that this London of contrasts was home to people of significant and almost unimaginable wealth, as well as to people dying of flu in overcrowded rooms, home to families of up to 20 people. Similarly, Edinburgh of Stevenson's youth was as divided and different as the two characters that make up the name of his novel. In today's Edinburgh, there's the old town and the new town, and this new town was built in the late 18th century as the upper classes and better off people of the city had basically grown tired and frustrated of living so close to people of lower classes. And the new part of the city was constructed within walking distance of the old town. But whereas the new town where Stevenson grew up had bright street lighting and wide streets and all of those sort of immaculately kept homes, the old town was left to decay further. Here there were dangerous characters of all descriptions, thieves, drunks, prostitutes and murderers, all within walking distance of the respectable citizens of Edinburgh. Now, it's this interesting facet of Edinburgh that leads many people to believe that while the action takes place in London, the story is really at heart from the winding alleyways and divided society of Edinburgh. As we saw when we talked about the author, Stevenson became very popular, very familiar with the old town of Edinburgh, and would have mostly kept these activities secret. Just like many other upper class gentlemen, he would have made the short walk from the new town to the old to sample its darker atmosphere. Stevenson in public was a fine young man from a fine family who was set to be a great lawyer or an engineer, and again the dual nature, the double life, is something that strikes a chord with Dr. Jekyll in the novel. Another fine gentleman from this period who Stevenson was very interested in and even wrote about, but the story was never published, was a man called Deacon Brodie. Now, Deacon William Brodie was an upstanding gentleman, a master craftsman who made cabinets, and he was a city councillor. He had the title of deacon as he was head of one of the city's trade guilds, a sort of association of craftsmen, which would have been a very important title to have in 18th century Britain. Because of his status, Brodie associated with all of the finest people in Edinburgh. He also repaired cabinets and locks and mechanisms on them, and he had access to the finest homes and wealthiest families in the city. All of this meant that he was the last person anyone suspected when there was a sudden increase in burglaries in all of the finest homes in the city. Now, as it turned out, because of his gambling debts that he'd incurred from spending his evenings in the old town, associating with criminals, Brodie needed money, and considering he had such a good knowledge of the homes and the locks and cabinets of the richest people in the city, he took it from them. Again, the resemblance with Jekyll and Hyde is plain to see. A respectable gentleman by day and a dangerous criminal by night. The fact that Stevenson wrote a piece of work based on him is evidence enough to suggest that he had a big impact on the young man, but also the fact that in his bedroom as a child there was one of Brodie's cabinets is also very interesting. Much has been said and written about why Stevenson decided to set his story in London. Some say that he simply wanted the story to make more money. People in London would have been more interested in the story if it was set in the city they were from. But this is slightly less believable than another theory that further deepens the idea of the dual nature of man. In London in the 18th century, there was a surgeon by the name of John Hunter. He was also known as the Knife Man. He was a pioneering surgeon and made many discoveries, and in order to develop his knowledge of human anatomy, he had to do dissections. Now, at this time, it was legal only for aspiring surgeons to carry out dissections on the dead bodies of criminals who'd been executed. As with sexuality, Victorian society was squeamish about the idea of men cutting up decent gentlemen and women, even if they were already dead, and even if it was for the pursuit of medical knowledge. This was a time of really quite rapid development in science and medicine. We'll talk about that more in the video that's coming up on context. And if surgeons wanted to keep up, they had to have a good supply of bodies. Now, in Edinburgh at the time, there were two famous men, William Burke and William Hare, who made a lot of money from digging up bodies that had recently been buried and selling them to a well-known surgeon in the city. Of course, this was entirely illegal, but they made so much money they decided they would get them even fresher and began to murder people and bring the bodies around to the surgeon's home. Now, Stevenson would have again been familiar with this story and even wrote a story about it himself called The Body Snatchers. The famous John Hunter in London may have been acquiring bodies in the same way, but even the ones that were legal, the bodies of executed criminals, would have caused a stir when they were delivered to his front door. A respectable home is what is today Leicester Square. To combat this, he bought the house behind his own home and he knocked down the walls. He built connecting corridors, which meant that to the front he had a beautiful, well-decorated home where he would entertain guests and enter and exit. But to the rear he built dissecting rooms and lecture theatres, and exiting out onto a very unfashionable and grotty Castle Street, he had the back door where the bodies were to be left in the morning. So you can see all the way through the influences of the dual nature. Now, whether or not Stevenson had London or Edinburgh in mind for Jekyll and Hyde, it's clear that he's borrowed from both. Edinburgh itself is divided, a city with two personalities or faces, the respectable upper-class one and the lower, dangerous and illicit one. He also borrowed from John the Knife Man Hunter the idea for Jekyll's home, a respectable front to something much darker and sinister. And in fact, the description of Dr. Jekyll's home in the story is so close to that of Hunter's that it has to be more than a coincidence. Guys, if you found this video useful, please do subscribe to the channel. Pick up a copy of the ebook as well. It's only £3.99, absolute bargain.